Hello, my name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy&Future. And today my guest is again Nicholas Myers. It's, I think, part number 3 already, installment number 3, whatever you call it. We simply discussed the Baltic state security. We discussed the Baltic state security, choke points. Now we will touch on Belarus, right? And of course, NATO Eastern Flank, modern warfare strategy, and everything that Nicholas is bringing to the table, and its abundance of that. So that you will find out yourself or yourselves. So hello, Nick, let's get going. Belarus, that's the question of this evening.
Yes, let's see what we can do. So unlike Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, unfortunately, I have not physically been to Belarus, so my tactical knowledge of the country is less detailed than it is further north. But I have had plenty of opportunity to stare at it on Google Earth and turn it into a whole series of different interlocking computer code, trying to understand this and research the history. So we're going to talk a bit more on the strategic, operational, rather than tactical level today, but it's such an interesting region that we're not going to get anywhere close to out of matter to discuss. So Belarus is still sort of a kind of a mystery country to many people in the West, because unlike most of the other countries around it, it does not have a very clearly discerned history that is talked about frequently in Western literature. And that's kind of unfortunate. It's a result of the fact that the Belarusian identity is the Eastern Slavic identity that had more interaction with the with Polish leadership, and in particular integration into the Commonwealth and interaction with the Catholic Church. So a lot of the old identity of Belarus comes from the Uniate faith, the Kresy identity to a certain extent of the early 20th century. And perhaps most importantly, in terms of defining it for modern Russians, is the decision, not so much decision, but insight at the end of the Tsarist era of the so-called Novocherkassk to Pskov line, which divides how certain consonants are sounded within the Eastern Slavic peoples. I believe it was Prince Trubetskoy, one of the last ones, who was a great philologist, who discovered that the accent shifts very suddenly to the west of those two cities. And then from there, the division point becomes north and south of the Pripyat marshes, which differentiates Belarus from Ukraine. So as a result, like Belarus, unfortunately, is sort of in the back of everyone's imaginations. And I hear this frequently when I'm interacting with US military personnel in particular, who's come to, when they're focusing on Europe, have to learn about all these different aspects of various NATO member states. And then after that, we'll learn about Russia. And then there's this country in between called Belarus with whom they're not really supposed to talk to. And it's sort of a big mystery right in the middle of the battlefield that they're supposed to be learning to understand. So if we're trying to break down how Belarus works on the strategic routes of Europe today, I know Jacek has already written quite a bit about the so-called Smolensk Gate, which is very conveniently shown by this major highway that has since been built through the middle of Belarus, going from Smolensk in Russia down to Brest on the Polish border. Now, this is not necessarily where the Smolensk Gate has always been. In fact, as we discussed previously before, the Smolensk Gate historically more frequently went through Vilno and Vilnius via Minsk as opposed to Brest, but it's sort of the morphing point of the modern geography based on the current political boundaries as we now are looking at the world today. As we're trying to identify the different constraints on Belarus, obviously, the big one that people talk about, honestly, a little too much, is the Pripyat Marsh. So the Pripyat Marsh is this area in the south, famously now mostly home to Chernobyl, but with plenty of areas that are not irradiated, that is a major wetlands. And it was thought, especially before World War I, that this is going to be a huge barrier to all future movement.
Nicholas, if I may,
yes.
just as a poll, let me just add 2 sentences to what you just said. For Poland, Belarus is an eastern buffer, screening us from Russia, and Ukraine the same. And the Pripyat marshes that you have just mentioned were separating those 2 war theaters. And having the eastern frontiers in our hands in the old times, but still in the 20th century, allowed our commanders to see where the center of gravity is. I mean, whether the Russians are marching in the north or in the south. And we could defeat them in detail, one after another. Okay, near Brest, there was our main force, and we could choose the axis. I mean, we could beat them one by one. And that was the most fundamental and important pattern of the Polish war theater, as we call it. And the Germans used it as well, by the way, in the Second World War. And the Soviets, the other way around as well in 1944. Okay, now your turn.
Oh, yes. Obviously, the Polish audience will know off the top of their head that Tukhachevsky came via the northern route, whereas Budyonny was coming from the southern route. And because there's such a large distance between them, Poland was able to intercept them at different times. In fact, Budyonny, I don't think even really made it to Poland because Tukhachevsky had already been defeated by that time.
Yes.
Nevertheless, the discussion of the Pripyat marshes being an operational barrier have a pretty solid foundation in the modern era. I was starting to say, like, the Kaiser used to joke with his general staff about being able to do a pincer movement of forcing the entire Tsarist army into the swamp, after which they'd be able to occupy the whole country by the end of a couple of months. To a certain extent, that assumption has been undermined since the Second World War, when the Soviets used the fact that the Germans were certain that the Pripyat Marsh couldn't be the basis of an attack to become the center of several Maskirovka offensives toward Brest, coming from the Pinsk area, after they had already begun their conventional offensives at other points on the front. As a result, when we're thinking about, like, the defense of Ukraine today against a potential Russian attack, the possibility of the Russians advancing through Belarus at several different points, indeed even through the area that still is irradiated by Chernobyl, is not actually inconceivable. It's not an operational barrier, but it really does canalize the movement dramatically. If the Russians are going to attack from Belarus into Western Ukraine in any possible scenario, there's only about 5 or 6 major axes that would be usable. Then they would need quite a bit of engineering support, because they would not want it to be so contingent upon a couple of different locations to go across.
And still, for the audience to know that it's not, again, the old school discussion about the things in the theater. It really mattered when there was a situation in the Donbass 6 years ago. The foreign minister of Ukraine was really probing Lukashenko to make sure that the Lukashenko will not allow Russian troops to move from the north towards Kiev and Rovne and Lutsk, because the Ukrainians at that time were transferring troops eastwards. That was the largest deployment across Europe since the Second World War. Ukraine is a huge country, and they needed to move forces from the west, exposing the northern flank. So it was a critical thing that Lukashenko, ensures that this northern road from Russians, it's not open from Russians. And Lukashenko mentioned that a month ago in an interview with the Ukrainian journalist. So it's still, a thing. They know it. People of the ex-Soviet Union understand that very well.
And indeed, one of the legacies of the communist era is that the military bases of Belarus, Ukraine, and of course also Poland are overwhelmingly concentrated in the western part of the country. In Ukraine, they also had a number of legacy installations in Crimea prior to it being seized in 2014. But it's one of it's one of those things that dictates some of the ways that the modern Belarusian military infrastructure is set up. If we look at the map at large, with the government in Kyiv now much more pro-Western than perhaps it has ever been, Belarus, as a remaining Russian ally, really does appear to be one large salient in Europe, where Russia has the potential to put a major strategic force right on the border, but also has the potential to be shut out, at least for a certain period of time. If we think about Russian access to Europe on a military scale, with or without Belarus, it's almost a completely different story. Indeed, if we're talking about how Russia would attack Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania without access to Belarus, it really dramatically complicates what sort of planning they would have to do, because there would only be a couple of axes they'd be able to use. There'd be very few ways to actually draw local forces away from the front, except by imperiling Kaliningrad Oblast, probably more than they want. And so, as a result, we're seeing right now that the Russians really are not going to entertain any possibility of them losing access to Belarus as a strategic territory, despite the fact that Russian analysts in Moscow are extremely sensitive to how unfaithful Lukashenko has been as an ally over the past several years. Despite the fact that Lukashenko did try to come up with some sort of middle ground after the 2014 events in Ukraine, and remained part of the Russian alliance and even increased to a certain extent military interoperability with the Russians over the first several years, Lukashenko has always had a vision in his mind of opening Belarus as the gateway between Russia and Europe, as opposed to definitively trying to be a Russian satrapy. It's been recited several times over the past couple of months as people remember who Lukashenko is because he's in the news. But part of the reason for the Union State was because Lukashenko thought that he was going to succeed Yeltsin as president of a grander Russia. And this did not come to pass in the year 2000. But even if that had pulled off here, the part of Lukashenko's political identity has been trying to be a window between West and East. Now, there's been a variety of reasons why this doesn't function. In particular, the Russians have been attempting to establish the customs union, now the Eurasian Economic Union, over Belarus to keep protected trade within the former Soviet frontiers because of just uncompetitive Russian businesses that might cause severe distress to the population that the government doesn't want to deal with if they were open to European competition. But as a result, a lot of the borders that set Belarus as sort of this other country beyond NATO and the European Union are really artificial and recent. Now, if we go into how the Belarusian military is actually structured, though, as I mentioned, it was most of the military infrastructure was facing the western border, along with the Soviet tradition. It divides its forces into two operational commands, the Western Operational Command and the Northwestern Operational Command. So there's not exactly any controversy as to which borders they're concerned about. Notable, though, is that it appears that they still have not developed any serious contingency for attacking Ukraine with Belarusian forces. Now, if the Russian Federation decided that they were going to use Belarusian territory to attack Ukraine, yes, Belarus could put up a big stink about it. It might even create a major diplomatic crisis, but I'm not going to suggest that they could physically stop the Russians from using the territory. I would suggest, however, that if the Russians were forced to oppose the Belarusians on the way in and potentially broaden this into a much larger regional conflict with Belarus itself, this is not a territory that Russia can simply annex the way that we imagine in our heads the way Crimea was annexed. Belarus is much, much larger than Crimea. has a much larger population. The population of Russia is not of the opinion that Belarus is inherently a part of Russia, whereas there was quite a lot of resentment over the fact that Crimea was lost territory before 2014. And even under the circumstances of the Russian population being whipped into an interest in taking control of Belarus, it would be an enormously long-lasting and very arduous process of first breaking whatever institutions that are resisting Russia, which may not be all of them, several of them may cooperate, but then reestablishing control. The local government institutions of Crimea within Russia today took about a year to establish, and there was virtually no resistance whatsoever. They didn't finish putting in all of the new police units that they need to protect the infrastructure they recently built until, I believe, the beginning of 2019. So we're talking 12 months of intensive institution building and 5 years of actually finishing all of the touches on it. But you're going to try to attempt this over the entirety of Belarus. It's just a huge order of magnitude different. Do you have something you wanted to add here?
Actually, I was thinking to add a lot, but maybe let's run the narrative, and I'll just be maybe dropping in some additional comments. So one additional comment would be as follows. If we take a look at the region, you will see that Belarus is a pivot. If Belarus is a Russian sanctuary or in Russian hands to project power, then Ukraine independence and communication to the West from Poland is in peril. The Baltic states' status is entirely dependent then upon the Russians' behavior, as there is no effectively capability to help them in war. The Polish planning to send forces towards the Nemunas River and the Daugavpils River to help the Balts will be debatable at best, as Poland will be simply threatened by the Belarusian territory. And most importantly for Poland, if it's a sanctuary for Russian heavy troops with logistics, then the complete composition of force posture will change for Poland, as the main operational base will be Belarus. Kaliningrad Oblast was not such a thing. It was more of the besieged territory from the military perspective, and not enough of the strategic depth to create the operational base. So we could have been thinking about helping the Baltic states. If Belarus is in Russian hands with a heavy power projection capabilities close to Warsaw, of which we'll discuss next time, I hope, Nicholas, that changes the game, the last sentence, and that will change the NATO eastern flank posture, as the current one will be completely inadequate, and that will trigger the security dilemma of Poles, Ukrainians, and the Balts.
It's unfortunate to be talking about Belarus exclusively through terms of geostrategic games, but that is unfortunately what it essentially comes down to at this point, since Lukashenko has utterly failed to build an effective state. And here I would point out that the Russians do not have a very clear concept as to what are the more and less Russian or Belarusian parts of Belarus. Very occasionally, you will hear Vladimir Zhirinovsky in Moscow rant about how Vilnius is technically a Belarusian city and that the Belarusians should invade it right away. But this is his usual political theater, which I'm told he does not actually pursue in his private life. But perhaps the even better anecdote to illustrate this is that during the negotiation process of the Treaty of Riga between Poland and the Soviet Union in the 1920, the Poles did not realize that the Soviets were prepared to pretty much dump all of what is today Belarus because they were not particularly interested in defending it. The western parts of Belarus, similar to the western part of Ukraine, is notoriously difficult to actually hold. It's only once you get past the more open plains and towards some of the swampier areas and the rivers of the central part of the country that feed into the Dnieper that infamously ravaged Napoleon's supply lines in 1812, 1814, that it becomes something that really you have clear lines to delineate here. And so the Treaty of Riga is effectively just the most defensible and least aggravating line that could be drawn across the middle of Belarus. There's no actual magic line.
And of course, I must add my 5 cents as well. Yes, there was a big debate in Poland in the 20s and the 30s, and it's coming back again in terms of history and the active defense nowadays. The strategic lines of defense of the Commonwealth, of the empire of Poland, Lithuania, was along the Dvina, Daugpilis River and the Dnieper River up to the Smolensk Gate. In good times, we also had a forefront ahead of the Dnieper River towards Russia proper as a sort of the buffer area. Additionally, and militarily, we defeated Russians in 1920, and we could have taken the Smolensk Gate. And part of our officer corps and the leaders wanted that, but most of them didn't. Plus, society was tired of war and this great war, and Piłsudski also wanted to secure our borders against the strategic lines of the big rivers, but didn't manage it politically. We were already worn out, and that meant, and he understood that we won the war, but we lost the peace. And that's the summary. And it was only a pause that ended 20 years later. And it's important to understand that these days it's also important, not because Poland has some imperial, sort of ambitions or projects, but in active defense where you can strike deep, see deep, and you can impose your will far away from the main operational base in post-INF treaty and, modern scouting battle. Again, those two rivers, Daugpilis and Dnieper, matter very much in terms of the active defense of the intermarium. And this concept is maturing in the intermarium elites more and more increasingly.
And a lot of the cities of northern Belarus in particular, such as Vitebsk, were founded exclusively as transit points between those two rivers. So yes, those two rivers are going to be the focal points for how this gate is closed when eventually it is. Now, I was saying a moment ago that Lukashenko has failed to do serious state building. And there are a couple of institutions that you can debate to what extent they would seriously oppose the Russians or not. But one institution that is pretty much entirely plugged into the Russian military in a way that Russian infrastructure in the way that the Ukrainians never were before 2014 is in fact the Belarusian armed forces. To illustrate this, the Belarusians did open a general staff academy a couple of years ago. Sometime in the 21st century, I'm forgetting the precise year, but its commandant is a colonel. But the current Belarusian defense minister was trained at the General Staff Academy in Moscow, as well as pretty much all the other major Belarusian commanders. It's not that they're disloyal to their home country, it's just that they are entirely part of the Moscow engine of how resources are distributed across the portions of the former Soviet Union. And you'll see, therefore, that when the Belarusians run major military exercises, they are essentially reprising the Zapad exercises that we've seen over the past couple of years. So what precisely occurs in the course of these Zapad exercises, and how is the Belarusian military planning it today? In essence, there's two macro plans. The first one, the Western Operational Command, which would be directed straight at Poland, is built around a pretty simple premise. You've probably seen the old map, it's now very old, I think it's from the year 2000, that claims that the Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are going to be used as a forward NATO base with which to attack St. Petersburg in the indefinite future. And therefore, the Russians need to counterattack into Poland in order to cut off the offensive coming from the north. So in the Western Operational Command, the exercise tends to involve shoving as many Russian and Belarusian forces right on the border near Grodno and Brest, with the intention of doing a subsequent encirclement of Warsaw, which we will discuss precisely how that functions at a future time. The second option that is frequently considered is the Northwest Operational Command, involves moving through that gateway, through the Medininkai gate into Vilnius in order to attract pressure from the Lithuanians elsewhere, while doing a much larger sweep out of the Vitebsk Oblast into Daugavpils, and then potentially either reinforcing a Russian attack coming from further north near Pskov, or else determining what further needs to be done. I am unaware of the extent to which the Belarusians have any independent thinking as to what they would do with those tactical and operational objectives. My sense from reading through Belarusian press releases and so forth is that there is no interest in actually starting a war under virtually any circumstances. In fact, one of the key advantages of Belarus not being the same country as Russia is that in the event of a diplomatic crisis, it's relatively simple to perceive, just using elementary SIGINT, how the frequency of communications relaying between Minsk and Moscow. If Russia is actually going to attempt a rather serious attack against NATO, or thinking that a certain deployment into Belarus is more important than just exercise, then we should be able to perceive an increased amount of communication, because the government in Minsk is not going to be in favor of being part of a war in which they're going to be a major target. A good example of this is the ongoing debate over whether or not the Russians can have an air base inside of Belarus. So at the moment, there are 2 Russian bases inside Belarus, but neither of them have any significant number of forces.
Let's show them on the map then.
I'm trying to remember where precisely they are. They're so small, I'm not sure they're even going to show up on the map, but one is in Meranovice, and it is a radar station. I really don't know which suburb it's in. It's probably near the airfield, but I'm not saying I have any expertise here. But in Baranovice, there's a Volga radar station. It's no longer necessary. It's basically, it's an early warning radar that has since been replaced by capabilities in Kaliningrad. And then secondly, in Vilyevka, which I'm remembering where that is, neither does it. Neither does the system.
Nowa Vilejka, yes? It's
Sorry?
Nowa Vilejka, yes? It's in the north.
Yes. This other facility is a communications platform with Russian submarines.
Yeah, Nowa Vilejka, yes.
Sorry?
Nowa Vilejka, in Polish at least. Nowa Vilejka, that's the name of it.
So neither of these are technologically needed anymore. In fact, none of the Russian radar stations outside of Russia are technologically necessary, except for the Okno facility in Tajikistan. They're basically maintained in order for the Russians to have some presence in these countries. But the Russians have been pressing it to actually open an air base in particular inside of Belarus for some time. The clamoring for this has decreased of late for a variety of reasons. Most likely the fact that the Polish possession of JASM missiles drastically reduces the usefulness of an air base that is forward. So for a long time, the Russians wanted to use the Baranovice air base, which is currently the home of the Belarusian Su-25 ground attack fighters. And they've all, after that was the big push in the early 2010s. When they started to sour on the idea as they learned that Poland was acquiring the JASM, the backup option has become a Bobruisk in the southeast here. I'm not sure this airbase is even technically being used on a day-to-day basis. Their point was they were going to revitalize it. It's not, as you'll see here, it's sufficiently far away from the front that it's not a particularly it's going to be less useful for tactical sortie generation. The Russians have dumped an incredible amount of resources over the past 5 years into rehabilitating their recovery airfields, as we used to call them. Back in 2014, we were first starting to research the capabilities of the Russian Air Force after so many years of them being largely ignored in the civilian world. It's not like we couldn't find recovery airfields around Russia. It's just that they were all in tremendous disrepair. But in 2015, Shoigu put a huge effort into repairing them. At one point, I think he admitted that something like 80% of them were underutilized and had to be fixed up. But as we're seeing from just the frequency of these recovery airfield exercises since 2017, they are now in much better shape, which leads me to suspect that the tactical use of having an additional forward air base in Belarus is declining further unless the Russians really start to fix up a lot of the legacy recovery bases inside of the country. And indeed, back during the Soviet era, the Belarusian military infrastructure was not largely active. They had one major division in Minsk, which is still the major brigade that would be used for rapid response by the Belarusian Armed Forces, is the 120th Guards Mechanized Brigade. It was previously the demonstration division for new Soviet equipment. But by and large, though there were a huge number of tank divisions in Belarus, they were all at mobilization or lowest readiness, because the point was that they would mobilize the Soviet reserves into Belarus, marry them with their equipment, and then shove them into trains across Poland and into East Germany. It was just most convenient to keep all of this equipment in Belarus. But it complicates Russian understanding of Belarus as a strategic forward point, because the entire assumption was that it was a safe rear area in which to marry the troops, wherein East Germany and Poland would be the major vectors of NATO attack during the Cold War. And it's kind of, at least as far as I can tell, it's regressed the degree of Russian readiness of understanding the terrain, how they are going to fight across the majority of the country if they had to either defend Belarus or have to do a counterattack in the forward area, especially since, similar to Western Ukraine, the western parts of Belarus are notoriously difficult to defend. It's much easier to simply wait until the opportunity to counterattack emerges. On top...
If I may add, yes. In terms of defense and offense, and a sort of a critical piece of terrain, actually a barrier, that everything revolves around in Belarus is the Nemunas River, in Polish Niemen River. That is flowing through Grodno, Mosty, and the Stolce east of Baranowice, and cuts 1/3 of Belarus. So it's always an operational barrier, sometimes strategic barrier, in all wars between Russia and Poland, and Germany and Russia, and so on and so forth. That is critically important in order to project power. And maybe next episode with Nicholas, we will talk in detail, granular detail, so to speak, and that's my ambition. We will zoom in to show Grodno, why Lukashenko is talking about Grodno all the time and the exercise there, and how it impacts Suwałki corridor and movement through the corridor, how it impacts the Polish war plans. So existence of connectivity hub in Grodno and the Nemunas River, and down south as well. We promise to analyze it in granular manner, if that's a good word, in next episode. So you will see the details, bridges, and real stuff, forests, how troops move, and how people react to threats and challenges, and how military is thinking about it. And Grodno is a critical place on the Nemunas River.
So I was going to go into discussion about Grodno next, but we'll save that for next time then.
Yeah, we can start, Nicholas. I think we will have 3 hours about Grodno itself. So really just do as you wish, do as you please.
So what are the difficulties that comes up with understanding what capabilities Russia can or cannot surge into Belarus? It was recently demonstrated in Slavyanskaya Bratstva. This is an exercise that was originally supposed to be Russia, Belarus, and Serbia, but the European Union supposedly leaned very heavily on the Serbs not to participate this year. They've done it on a number of other occasions. But this year, just a couple of weeks ago, it was in Brest. It's specifically, I believe, this polygon here just to the south of the city, where they did what the most common way of Russian interoperability with Belarus functions, which is through the VDV, the airborne troops. Michael Kaufman likes to call them the Russian variant of the Marines, which I think is more accurate than inaccurate, as with a couple of differentiating details. But it's definitely true that the airborne troops of Russia and the Belarusian equivalent, which is the Special Operations Forces, they call them, though they also descend from the Soviet VDV, are by far the most interoperable of the Russian and Belarusian forces. Now, if I recall correctly, it was originally just supposed to be effectively a one-regiment exercise, and there were officially only 900 Russian forces involved in this particular exercise here, as you'll see, right on the Polish border. But because of Lukashenko's difficulties and the fact that he had to basically mortgage his geostrategic soul to the Russians in order to stay alive, the Russians then proceeded to start sending in a lot more reinforcements for the second half of the exercise. As probably was communicated to the West via closed channels, which I don't have access to as an open source researcher, but the Russians brought in, it appears to be battalion-sized components coming from 2 other VDV divisions, representation from across the entire Western military district at a very short notice, using some of the larger military transport aviation that they have available. In addition to which, they started operating long-range aviation airstrike capabilities with this. Now, from the incomplete sources I have from flight radar and elsewhere, it seems that the Russian long-range aviation did not actually enter Belarusian airspace. Instead, it flew right on the Belarusian border, and some of it launched missiles directly across all of Belarus. So we're talking, if a flight is the long-range aviation, so I believe this was Tupolev 22s that were shooting in this case, were Smolensk and Bryansk Oblast. They were hitting that polygon right on the Polish border, south of Brest. Now, this demonstrates some of the elementary capabilities that the long-range aviation can do, especially since it doesn't look like this was the planned exercise that they were going to do. Or at the very least, that's what the Russians want us to think. Peskov went to some length, Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, went to some length to claim that that Lukashenko had specially requested that the exercise be expanded for its second phase. And it's typical in Russian international exercises, especially with a close ally like Belarus, that you would have 2 phases, one of which is basically building up the capabilities of the officers to be working with each other on a tactical level. And the second phase is, now that we know all the different tools, let's practice doing an operation together. So it's usually that second phase, which is much more interesting to analysts such as myself. Although the first part's probably more useful for long-term military ties. Second part basically being only managed by general staff officers in Moscow. But nevertheless, it's quite interesting that they were able to snap that into place. Now, perhaps it shouldn't be interesting. After all, in 2014, some time ago, the Russians were able to use Provyerki to get an invasion-size force to the Ukrainian border. But considering just the fraught diplomatic conditions that have been prevailing over Europe for some time, And here we need to emphasize that the frequency of bombers flying over Europe this year is unusual. And the Russians had been very, very clued into this ballet. But the ability to simply just drop more in there seems to be a direct response to a complaint that the U.S., not a complaint, but a gloat that the U.S. Air Force had made, I believe, a week prior at their major convention, where they announced the secret airplane that they had been testing, that the Russian long-range aviation would never have enough pilots that Stratcom does in the United States. And therefore, we can confidently state that if we just kept escalating our presence there, the Russians would not be able to respond in a what I like to call the ballet manner of some of these flight responses. I think that this long-range aviation component to Slavyanskaya Brasa was specifically to sting that belief in the United States. I wouldn't say that the U.S. officers are that naive. I think this guy was the guy who said it was attempting to put on some bravado for the United States side, or put out some of his own information warfare. But there we have it. 3 separate long-range aviation flights occurred in the space of, I think, 4 days or 3 days. 2 of which involved patrolling the Belarusian borders. It remains to be unclear whether or not they actually entered Belarusian airspace, and 1 actual strike that appears to have come from inside Russian territory. Now, we'll go into some further detail next time when we're going through the pattern by which Russian forces would deploy against Poland specifically in granular detail. But it should be one of the things that we need to watch when we are looking at the Russian and Belarusian interactions is where specifically in the country are these exercises taking place? Because the Belarusians do not welcome the Russians everywhere. It's sort of this ongoing joke that the Russians love to say when they visit Minsk or elsewhere, is that it's almost like being at home. If you read or listen to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov's speeches whenever he shows up in Minsk, it's like, oh yes, it's not really a foreign country. We feel like we're at home here. And lots of NATO military inspectors at Zapad 2017 reported that the Russians were basically treating Belarus as their own home territory themselves, much to the Belarusian soldiers' disgust, as they thought that they should at the very least be acting like guests, which to an American audience, the Americans are congenitally addicted to this concept of my house is your house. This is not a component of East Slavic culture. When you are a guest in someone's house, you are supposed to be respectful. The Russians will soon enough invite you to treat it like your own house, but only after you've proven yourself. It usually takes a day or 2. So it's very much a cultural faux pas that was going on. But when the Russians do exercises inside Belarus, they typically only do it in 2 places. First is that polygon just south of Brest, and the other one is a place called the Losvido, which is near Vitebsk, which is where the other of the VDV brigades, the Special Operations Forces brigades now in Belarus is based. It matters considerably less whether or not or which particular VDV formation is going in, as there's 4 major units, all of which operate with the Belarusians very frequently. However, when we see that they go to other places outside of those, in particular, I'll point out here, and we'll go into much more detail about this next time, the Gorsky Vayna Teniofi Polygon, can never read Cyrillic when it's in cursive like that. That's right on the Lithuanian and Polish tri-point here. I don't recall the last time the Russians did it, but it's one of those things that if the Russians suddenly did show up there, it would cause considerable consternation and ruin every NATO military intelligence officer's weekend, I can tell you right away. But it's tracking those particular locations. And I'm going to, our next conversation, I imagine, walk through each of the particular places where the Russians have done these exercises before, and then figure out how you would do the subsequent breakout from those places to do maximal damage attacks on NATO territory. Specifically looking at the area south of that Ice Age divider I mentioned in our very first talk. Do you have any other things you want to mention while we still have time?
No, just go on. Utterly interesting. I just keep looking at this Suwałki corridor, this narrow passage between the Kaliningrad and the Belarus, and entering the Lithuanian territory. And also, I've been thinking intensively, although my face didn't betray that, about this long-range fires, long-range precision munition fire that you mentioned as being shot from the Smolensk gate to the almost proximity of the Polish border, where actually I was, and on the other side of the border when we talked 2 weeks ago, and we also made some recordings out of UAVs, and we will make a film, a Strategy and Future, about it, with a commentary in English and in Polish for you to know. But I really am looking forward to doing a more granular, just step-by-step main axis of advance. Also the Polish eastern part of Poland as one component of the war theater, because our audience should know that actually from the Berezyna River and even from the Smolensk Gate, there is no barrier until you reach the Vistula Valley. So usually when there is a major offensive in multiple wars that were waged here in Europe, once you move out from Warsaw outskirts, then usually you end up on Smolensk fortress. And the other way around as well, because there are not so many barriers, and the terrain is sort of inviting you to take offensive action and not stop, okay, until your logistics run out. So this is our nightmare in Poland, okay? And of course, this has upper hand. This also creates some advantages, but currently with the NATO political architecture, and stuff, it's actually a burden, so to speak, for the NATO cohesion and for the NATO defense posture, so in the Baltic states especially. So, about that more in the next episode.
So one last strategic point I would make before we close this out then is that one development that the Belarusian military did have a couple of years ago that the Russians have been very ambivalent about, they've almost deliberately ignored it, is the development of the Pomiędzy MLRS. This is a multiple launch rocket system that appears to have been created with the support of the Chinese. And it is a fairly long range rocket system, pretty competitive with some of the longer range, some of the shorter range ballistic missiles that the Russians used to have. And for a country like Belarus that still has touch-gun missiles, this basically is a complement to them. Why I point this out is that not only does it have the obvious implications of being able to target the entirety of the Smolensk gap or Smolensk corridor, as well as considerable portions of Lithuanian, Latvian, Polish, and Ukrainian territory, this was something that shows possibly the limits of what the of what Moscow can control over its satrapies on the periphery. Back in 2014, we attempted a war game with a group of experts, which we gave to the Belarusian portfolio a very simple task that we sort of came up with on the fly because we didn't know what the Belarusian strategic objective was going to be at the time, saying, well, see if you can get nuclear weapons out of Russia. Because with the intention of making it relative to how Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons and was subsequently attacked, Belarus may need nuclear weapons to prevent future Russian aggression. This is sort of an ultimate guarantor of sovereignty. We had a Russian expert come at the end who told us in a very reassuring way that you do not need to worry. We will never, ever give any nuclear weapons to Lukashenko. Not exactly a surprise here. But giving out an operational capability that really ventures into the strategic, you can turn that Polonie's MLRS around. And if you imagine that the Minsk suddenly had a color revolution, or even that the opposition forces in Belarus took control and turned out to be stridently pro-Western, you could put into risk a considerable number of forward Russian infrastructure positions in Smolensk and Bryansk oblasts that have only just been reconfigured. So we should be aware, and I don't want to put too much emphasis on it, because I think this is one of Lukashenko's mistakes right now, is that he's overplaying his hand here, that Russia and Moscow are not the only overlords currently being considered in Belarus. The Chinese are definitely also in there. And I believe Xi Jinping sent congratulations to Lukashenko on his re-election a couple weeks ago, before even Putin managed to knock his off onto the Kremlin website. So we should be aware that while on the military side and thinking about the geographical implications of things, this is really very much a Russia question. China is increasing its presence there. And I close by saying that at the Kavkaz exercise, which of course took place way down here in Astrakhan Oblast at Kapustin Yar, was the major international component of it. Oh, again, only 2 weeks ago now. The Chinese and the Belarusians went out of their way to force themselves to be on the same team, on top of which the team that the Belarusians sent was from the Northwest Operational Command, i.e. not the one that you would expect the Russians to be using in a Kavkaz scenario, probably to be deliberately problematic, though also partly because Slavyanskaya Bratstvo was occurring at the same time. But that did not have an army component, so the brigade that is typically attached to the Western Operational Command was technically available for international exercises. And the Chinese used their group army that's based in Xinjiang, but in addition to oppressing Uyghur minorities, has also occasionally wargamed, attacking as far as Kazan. So we're looking at an interesting possible alignment here. I'm not going to say that they're anywhere close to China being able to turn Belarus against Russia as part of a large-scale sudden anti-Russia shift. But we are talking that they are deliberately seeking out how a cooperation would function. And they're doing this not just at the macro strategic level, but they're even starting to do this a bit at the tactical and operational levels. And for whatever much the Russians may have not liked it, they could not prevent it occurring at their own major exercise 2 weeks ago. But with that said, I think that's the end of the strategic discussions we can have about Belarus. I think next time we're going to go into much, much more detail about how the force disposition works out there, what the exercises between Russia and Belarus literally involve at a tactical level, and then how you would use those tactics to attack NATO territory. That sounds good to you.
Yeah, sounds great. And we make a promise with these words. The next episode will be about it. But before we wrap up, I had a question. And often in the military press, especially in the West, there pops up the argument that actually, it doesn't make any difference if the Russian forces with tanks and the heavy forces, if they are stationed in Belarus or they are not stationed in Belarus, because the transportation system, they can be easily transported. The Russians control the railways, and it doesn't make any difference. And it's like with the twist of the fingers, they can be the next on the Polish border. So it's even better than they are stationed in the Smolensk and around and south of it, because it's a strategic surprise. They are not so close to NATO, so they can choose the axis of operation and so on and so forth. While the other camp is saying that no, great guys, it's a heavy logistics. They need like 1,000 trains to get the First Guards Army to the border. So, and it's like a week at least, or even more if there are no problems. So, we can calculate it based on the sort of requirements of transportation. And what is your take on that, Nicholas?
It's a good question. The most important thing here is that we don't really have good data on this right now, because the most recent exercises the First Guards Tank Army has done inside of Belarus, like especially Zapad 2017, did not involve very large groups of forces. This may have been because Lukashenko put a stop to the fact that they were going to send entire divisions into the country. But if you keep it at that small grouping, you really can move things rather fast, because if there's anything the Russian armed forces are good at, it's trains. And on top of that, they're really getting their logistical capabilities back in order. I do, however, think that, again, on the strategic level, it does make a big difference for a very simple reason. Yes, if you have a large Russian base, like let's say it was in Brest, it'd be very, very easy to start destroying their C2 capabilities with NATO assets, probably firing as far away as France, maybe even the Atlantic Ocean if needed to be in a post-INF treaty world. However, if the forces are already there, the degree to which the Russians have to start giving some degree of warning, if only on the bureaucratic level of making sure that the railways are open when they're moving forces into Belarus, means that there are fewer intelligence opportunities to intercept that something is going on. And this is the major difference of between Belarus, between the formalization of the Union State, for example. If the Union State were actually functional and the Russians could simply move across the border whenever they felt like it, would it have a major military effect? Probably not, simply because the Russians are most likely not going to start a major fight with Poland unless they can get all of the forces they want into some degree of position ahead of time. However, if there's no longer a major bureaucratic hurdle that they have to go through, where if Lukashenko, for whatever reason, decides, no, he doesn't want a war to take place that's going to blow up several of his cities, there's much less opportunity for him to get on the phone and tell the Russians, like, no, you're not going to start this. And it starts to move the impetus closer and closer to the Russians on the ground creating facts that force Lukashenko to allow them to go through without interfering, especially if the Russians are so far forward inside of Belarus during peacetime. So as a result, I end up agreeing with the arguments of both camps. I just think that the significance here is that we do need Belarus as the alarm call for when something serious is going to occur. Can the Russians attack Ukraine without going through Belarus? Yes, there would be some complications that would occur, but it could be done. Can the Russians attack Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania without Belarus? Yes, but it's more complicated. It becomes a much more difficult operation to manage, and there's fewer places that NATO would need to close for Russian access, to stop Russian access into the Baltic region. But can Russia attack Poland without Belarus? No, there's no option here. And indeed, even with the Ukraine option, they really want the Belarus access, and Lukashenko does not want a war. I also suspect that whoever replaces Lukashenko, whether it's a Russian stooge or if it's the opposite, or it's a pro-Western opposition, also does not want a war inside of Belarus. And so we will continue to see some degree of bureaucratic resistance that we need to continue to monitor. So just see, it's a wonderfully non-committal answer, isn't it?
Oh yeah, that's why the strategic situation here is very complex. But still at Strategy and Future and with Nicholas Myers, we keep analyzing it. And the next episode will be the granular approach. That's my favorite word today. Granular approach to see exactly the terrain, and that was a strategic picture. We'll get into more operational picture and the nature of war as well, or maybe character of war that is evolving. Thank you for the time being. Nicholas.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Yes, and thank you to all the viewers. Stay tuned, stay with us with Strategy and Future. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Take care.